We've come far south. Beyond here, the oldest women shelling limas into black shawls. Portillo scratching his name on the walls, the slender ribbons of piss. Children patting the mud. If we go on, we might stop in the street, in the very place where someone disappeared. And the words, "Come with us," I hear them. If that should happen, we would lead our lives with our hands tied together. That is why we feel it is enough to listen to the wind jostling lemons, to dogs ticking across the terraces, knowing that while birds and warmer weather are forever moving north, the cries of those who vanish might take years to get here.
Welcome to Dead Air Live. I'm sitting here with Kirsten Giroux and Lisa Kent, who just created that theater piece you just saw, and they're here to talk about it. So Kirsten, would you like to say something?
Hi, Deborah.
About it?
How are you? The Country Between Us is a piece by Carolyn Forshey. It's actually 12 poems altogether that are based on a book of more poems than that. I don't know how many poems there are actually, by Carolyn Forshey, called The Country Between Us. Carolyn Forshey is an award-winning poet, a young poet, who got an NEA grant to go down to El Salvador, and she came back with these poems.
Mm-hmm. And how did you two decide to use those poems in this piece?
Well, Lisa and I have known each other for about 5 years. And about 3 years ago, actually, I remember one day we went to the museum and we were both enraged with the U.S. intervention into Central America situation that was going on at that time. We were very unhappy with it, and we felt compelled to do a piece. We thought there should be some theater piece done somewhere about that.
I think it's hard sometimes to feel that as an individual there's something that you can really do yourself. And I felt, and certainly Kristen feels from her other work as an actor, that there may be a way that we could find a piece that we could perform for people that would speak for us. And I certainly feel that Carolyn Forché's work is very powerful, and I feel very strongly about trying to show to as many people as we can what she has to say and her direct experience of having been there.
The other thing that really struck us about Forché's work is that she's an American. Lisa and I are American. Lisa's a Canadian American. And I mean, I have curly hair. I'm not quite dark and Spanish or Latin or anything like that. And I had no real interest in going out there and doing Chilean poetry or El Salvadoran women poetry or something like that. So I found in the New York Times a very famous piece of Carolyn Forché's called The Colonel, which you'll actually see later, which is a pretty amazing piece. And I thought, aha, this is the woman. She's an American, and she speaks with a very particularly American voice to an American audience about the Central American situation. And that's what really compelled us to do her work in particular.
Why don't you speak a little bit about why you do political theater at all? You know.
Well, I do political theater. I really feel that there are enough people out there doing Annie. There are enough people out there doing Cats. And there are enough people providing entertainment for everybody. There are also people who want to come to the theater and want something more than that. Now, there are lots of other kinds of theater pieces that provide middle ground things, like Sam Shepard is a playwright who will give you not particularly political things, but he will make social statements. I feel pretty strongly about doing some political theater because I want to bring to people in a more present way, in a more even entertaining way, what is going on in the world around them. And I think there are people who do want to come and see that. Now, there are also a lot of people who don't want to come and see it, you know, and they say, no, I just want to be entertained. But I think even those people, if given the right piece, you know, find that they do care. They do care about what's happening in the world politically. So, you know, that's one of the reasons I do it.
I think also both of our affiliations with Theater Works in Boston, certainly Theater Works feels very strongly that their whole premise for theater is to bring you into your life and not to take you out of your life. And also the work being work that's created, finding literature and adapting it for stage, or in this case poetry and adapting it for stage. Theater Works has had a great influence on me in terms of, you know, my experience of working with them. Last year, Kristen and I did a piece called Scheherazad's Sister, where I helped with the music and that, and just that whole process of creating as you go along, you know, rather than having a set script and with set direction or music to it, is also a very fulfilling kind of work to do.
There may be some people out there who don't know what Theater Works is, so why don't you say a few words about that?
Theater Works is a company that Lisa and I have worked for. I've been working for them for about 3 years now, which is a theater that is dedicated to creating new work. Or this summer we actually did a production of King Lear and a production of Taming of the Shrew, which we hit our classics for the first time. But as, for example, in the production of Taming of the Shrew that we did, it was an updated version of it, and it was a production that was about Kate getting tamed. And in that sense, I'd say it was a political production. It was a production that made a statement about what was happening to women and why that play back in Shakespeare's day maybe was a fun play and isn't now. But so Theater Works, over the last 3 years that they've been in existence, has actually been making new plays. In fact, Scheherazad's Sister, which Lisa sang and composed some of the music for, I co-adapted and acted in, was voted one of the best shows by the Phoenix and the Globe last year. And they have a very high critical acclaim in the city. And they're probably the only theater in the city at this time dedicated to new work.
Yeah. And you adapted that from a short story by John Barth,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And this show, Country Between Us, was adapted from poems by Carolyn Forché. And then you adapted Shakespeare from Shakespeare, so you could.
Well, we used, yes, sort of.
Good. Well, in a few minutes, or very soon, we'll be looking at the next taped insert from the show, The Country Between Us. So, would you like to say a few things about the next, I guess, 3 poems that are
Sure.
going to be on there?
Well, firstly, the first poem that they had a chance to see is called San Onofre, California. And that piece is
This
about
is the one we just saw. Okay.
And that piece is about being on the border of safe and unsafe. And I feel it's an interpretation of what any American would feel going into a Central American country and leaving behind what you think you know or where you think you are safe. So that is what that poem is about.
Joseph, which is the first poem in the segment that you're going to see now, is a poem the way that we've interpreted, I believe, to a childhood friend who probably has been hardened by war, probably lost track of the things that were most important to him, his ideals and his dreams, and as a result has found himself trapped within the very world that he was probably trying to escape and dreaming of escaping when he was younger. Memory of Elena will be the next poem in that section. And very simply, that's a poem that is a memory of a woman's husband, the anniversary of a woman's husband's death, his 3rd anniversary of his death. Whoa.
Yeah, actually his murder.
His murder.
And yeah, the third one that we'll be seeing is called Departure, and it's a very short poem. It's about being on a train and passing secret documents, identification papers, to someone who would need them for political safety. We have chosen to interpret this particular poem as a nightmare, and the sound score for this is meant to be suggestive of a train.
Okay, well, let's see that tape.
She wants the tape.
This is the moment you have to yourself. The slip of your knife along the windshield. When on cold winter mornings, you make your sack of sausage and apple. You walk where my father walked. You follow your brothers into that spray of stars, which is a steel mill. Past the high green windows of the steel mill in summer and the long rows of benches for lunch. This is the table where you make your bullets and line them up all fine and golden like silos in Dakota. Bullets from which the empty tin cans will pass daylight. It is a jeep almost paid for. A woman who comes home with you after a long bar night of smoke and poker. You lift her panties to your face, and it's all you have. And it's all your father had, and all your brothers. With you, they dip their lines into that silent and promising pool of summer, hoping, as they hoped, for more than fish. So you are worried about your life. Your voice carries across the state lines, over crispened fields of winter fodder, where snow hovers over wheat like moths, where moths hover. Your voice, blue in its wrapper of ice, blue with the breath of cupped hands. After 10 years, you want so fervently to talk about the war, like those that have gone to war before you. I listen for the cries that kill for meat, rabbits ripped from their furs, deers taken as a snake unfurls from a coil that is final. The boy from Iowa who cried into your pants and held your leg into a chopper wind of evacuation carried him out of your arms. You speak now of the accurate ballistics tables, of the years it took to kiss me and the morning we were called home. You say your hands are now whiskered with steel, the flickering remnants of your work. This is no life for you, Joseph. It is not enough. The white heads of beer, the fish, your winnings. When we were young, it was other than that. Your thighs through waist-high fields, your nets closing over cabbage moths, the small rocks where the early life of the world was pressed forever and the pond life trembled, the jars where all that was trapped afterlife, and songs to God from the open windows of our rooms where at night, without one another, we touched. But now, this feel of knife or fish, of bullet racing through something in the darkness, your voice slung on the wires that lapse, scalloping the cold length of the country between us. It is another voice that calls me after all these years. It has nothing to say to you, Joseph. Counting the dark tongues of bells that hang on ropes, waiting for the silence of an hour. We find a table, order paella, cold soup, and wine, while a calm light trembles years behind us. In Buenos Aires, only 3 years ago, it was the last time his hand slipped into her dress, with pearls cooling her throat and bells like these chipping at the night. As she talks, the hollow clopping of a horse, the sound of bones touched together, the paella comes, a bed of rice and cameroons, fingers and shells, lips the lips of those whose lips had been removed, muscles the soft blue of a leg socket. This is not paella. This is what has become of those who remained in Buenos Aires. The ring of a rifle report on the stones, her hand over her mouth, her husband falling against her. These are the flowers we bought this morning, the dahlias tossed on his grave, and bells waiting with their tongues cut out for this particular silence. The cry of a train slicing the field, leaving its stiff suture. A distant tenderness as when rails slip behind us and our windows touch the field where it seems the dead are awake and so reach for each other. Your hand cups the light of a match to your mouth and to mine, and I want to ask if the dead hold their mouths in their hands like this to know what is left of them. Between us a tissue of smoke, a bundle of belongings, the luggage that will seem to float beside us, the currency we will change and change again. Here is the name of a friend who will take you in, the papers of a man who vanished, the one that you will become when the man you have been disappears. I am the woman whose face you will not recognize, whose eyes were brief like the smallest of cities that we slipped through.
Okay, we were just talking here in the studio, watching this cut, how the last one we just saw actually seems to work better on video than it does in the theater. Could you talk some more about how you set the various pieces and how each of you interacted within each one?
Okay, well, that particular one of the reasons I think it works better on video is that the idea behind it is it's somebody sleeping, having a bad dream, and then she just wakes up. And the real focus of it should probably be on the eyes, waking up in the end, and just on the few jerky things that happen to you sometimes when you're having a bad dream while you're sleeping. And unfortunately on stage, it's very hard to isolate. You could probably isolate me from here to here, you could probably even isolate my face. But because the audience is so far away from you, you can't really isolate the eyes in the way that you can on video. So when Lisa and I saw it on the tape, we said, wow, that really works a lot. That looks a lot more like what we wanted it to be. Than it may feel. Now, I don't know what the effect is really being in the audience. I like to hope it works somewhat.
In general, working together or sometimes apart, I feel like the nature of the poem sort of lended itself to that. That in some cases we are, right together at the piano in a particular poem. Or in the case of Memory of Elena, I really feel that I need to be out of the way, that I want the sound of the flute to be heard as this sort of haunting phrase that keeps repeating and repeating, like the image keeps repeating, like a photograph in your mind of what that moment was when her husband fell against her. And I feel like the flute, that was my whole intention of the music in that piece, was that it be very simple and that the flute, again, be sort of suggesting that. But it felt like I should be out of the way of it, or you will be watching me play, and that isn't the point. The point is to be watching the same movement that Kirsten has. And I think, in general, the poems themselves lended themselves. Later on, we'll see the Colonel. And that feels very much like a duet, that she says something, I do something. She says something, I do something. And in general, just by really, when you take a look at something like poetry and you are adapting it, you have to be looking at it and looking at it and looking at it. And so, 2 weeks later you'll go, oh, I know what that word means now, or oh, I see. And, you just get so deeply involved that things start to come, out of themselves.
The great thing about collaborating with someone is that if you're stuck, for example, the Colonel we had millions of ideas about, but I remember Lisa came in one day and said, I have this idea. It should be line, da-dum-bum, it should be, she absolutely, we almost scored out the whole first section of that in one session, although we had gone through many, many ideas, so that if you're stuck with one thing, sometimes the other person comes in with something. If you're, you can sort of make up for the difference to a certain degree.
And having different backgrounds, my musical background and her theater background, again, I would be stuck with something, but she would do something, and I would get a rhythm out of her movement, and that would give me an idea.
Or Lisa, in the other way, would go, why don't you just extend that word? For a musical thing, or why don't you, she would refer to a line, which I'll call a line, as a phrase. So it's like, just do this with the phrase, or your phrasing is off there, or something like that, or why don't you try that? And it would be like, oh yeah, and it's a totally different kind of ear than what an actor would have in a lot of ways. I mean, I haven't studied music really, or anything like that, so I don't think like that. And it was sort of a terrific back and forth. The third member of this whole thing is our designer. His name is Helen Jarzembowski, who lives in Somerville and is a painter and a set designer and costume designer. And Helen was the other person who came in with a bunch of ideas for us. And sometimes she'd sit out there and go, I didn't get that, or, But what you saw actually on the screen is part of a whole bunch of ideas. You saw for the set a white stucco wall that she built, a 3-paneled white stucco wall with a grating for a window.
Okay, and that was what the knife was
That was what the knife was raking against, was the grating of the window. Above that, which you never really got to see in the video, there is in one section of the video, but it's not in the ones that anyone's watching tonight, was an American flag.
Oh, is it that flag?
It's the flag right there.
Over there behind the piano, yeah.
And the American flag was at least the size of the wall, so it loomed over this sort of Central American, the white wall was sort of evocative of a Central American prison, or a stucco white wall, a prison or something like that. But then you had this American flag, which was the exact opposite of what you were seeing. And Lisa's environment was sort of wooden with the piano and Well, why don't you talk about
Well,
what you found?
my environment, I think that they had a chance to see, had the piano, a guitar, and I had what was almost like 3 ladders, and hanging from the ladders were my musical instruments, although some of them were certainly not your classical musical instruments.
I think we saw that in San Onofre, the very beginning.
At the very
there was
beginning.
a shot of you
Yeah.
with all those things hanging. like
Right.
that, and you with your hammer.
Some of those, I'd like to describe what some of those things are.
I think some of them are right there.
Yes, we
yeah.
have a couple of them right here, which I'll demonstrate in a moment. From reading the poetry again a lot, what I found was I went first of all to a lot of images. To try to write the music, I tried first to get in touch with what are the images that are coming through. And so many of the images in the poems are abrasive and harsh and just very strong kinds of images like that, and violent. And so I felt that I needed to have, besides the piano and besides flute and besides guitar, which I knew I wanted to use, I needed to have some things there that could really come across as shocking. And in the very opening segments, before San Onofre, California, in the very first segment that everyone would have seen, there were gunshot sounds. And actually, what I had was a sheet of metal that I'm just banging against with some mallets. These things here, well, Helen and I had a great afternoon together in an auto body junkyard. And these are just car springs that we use in the show to give the sound of tolling, of church bells tolling. And they have their own resonance to them. And being that one is larger than the other, they have quite a different kind of quality. This one is much softer. So we had a great time running around with our mallets and hammers and just trying to find things that would evoke the kind of sounds that I was looking for.
Yeah. You also did some very different kinds of things with a piano than a classical pianist would normally do. So would you like to talk about some of those? And maybe demonstrate. We have the piano right here for you.
Okay, yes, I'd like to do that. Actually, part of what we did in San Onofre was simply to just, what I was doing was simply playing some sounds. But another sound that I had used, can I show? Okay. One of the sounds that I was using was just this strumming sound. Again, to just give a sense of danger. Again, San Onofre is the poem about being on the border and this feeling like someone could be watching you. And I just felt that the keyboard itself is just too classical sounding. And so I found that I was experimenting with the different sounds that the strings could make. After having had a chance to see the video that the Somerville Producers Group had done, I got some other ideas about how I'd like to change that particular poem. And I thought it might be interesting for you to see what the changes are that we're going to be doing. Why don't we show what it is that we did first? Okay, why don't you go ahead.
We have come far south. Beyond here, the oldest women shelling limas into black shawls.
Okay, that's how we would begin it before. After having seen the video, what I felt was that what I really wanted was to give a sense of the heat of being that far south. And so I've decided now that we are going to change that, and it would sound more like this. Go ahead.
We have come far south. Beyond here, the oldest women shelling limas into black shawls.
That really does heat it up to just draw it out like that. It's
Slowing it
amazing how
down.
just a tempo change can do that.
The other part that we were using was this sound here, using clusters at the point where Kirsten is saying, if we go on.
If we go on, we might stop. If we go on, we might stop in the street, in the very place where someone disappeared.
Right. And now, actually, what I'm going to be using when we do the show again is this sound. Why don't you start again?
If we go on, we might stop in the street, in the very place where someone disappeared.
quarter?
That's a quarter. Yeah, there's certainly been a lot of use of the piano and research and all kinds of composers in this 20th century that have taken the piano, certainly John Cage and other people, and put strings and pieces of metal and glass and used all kinds of the piano to create all kinds of sounds. And just using that, and the piano that I had to work on this piece with was a piano that in fact didn't have a cover to it. And it just lent itself to all kinds of things. So I found myself experimenting with muffling sounds, or in this case using other things to give a resonance.
Right, all the extra little dust and things that get in there would do stuff also. When you were working on this together, I don't know, you can. When you were working on this together, how did like Kirsten start reading, and then you just sit at the piano and see what she said sounded like, or would you start with a sound and then see how?
Yes, sometimes I would actually go by her voice quality, in that if she, again, I feel like Memory is just a very intense poem because of the nature of the woman falling. It's the memory of the murder, and I felt that it had to be something subtle, and so what instrument would I use? Again, piano didn't seem right. It felt like, no, if I could produce the sound that woman's voice might have made at that moment, what instrument would make that sound? Well, it would either be my own voice, perhaps, or what instrument, and I felt flute was right for that. Somewhat what decided things were more practical than that. I wanted a balance. I wanted a balance of not too much piano, not too much guitar or percussion or voice. So somewhat it would be, I had all things laid out in front of me, and I go, where am I using this? Where am I using this? What aren't I using very much of? And how can I find a way to use this more? I remember at one point feeling that way about my singing, that I wanted to have more of my voice. And at that point we found ways to, put things in. Also the taped sound, I wanted to have a certain amount of using tape. And, it is a very different kind of sound. But again, it's a very American thing to have tape. And I had my, big tape box sitting there, quite visible, and go and click it on. And that felt right, Yeah.
How did you create the sounds on the tape? I mean,
a lot of that was synthesizer. Again, experimenting, sitting there and just playing. I mean, it's a great toy. I mean, I don't actually have a lot of experience with a synthesizer, but just, using different preset sounds and then adjusting and trying to create sounds and trying to find, again, I would go in with images. I wanted something that sounded unnerving for departure, for that one on the train. Right. I wanted something unsettling. And I wanted it to be repetitive. I didn't want it to be a melody. I wanted just a sound. And I didn't, again, nothing that I had seemed to come to that. So I thought, no, let me try to find a synthesizer. Let me try to find some sounds that electronic, that could have that kind of a piercing kind of quality.
I noticed that in the show, actually you used repetition a lot. That there was the repeated falling in Elena, and also the repeated sounds. Sort of a bad dream quality came through that way, and almost the whole thing. And it was another thing struck me was that, again, sometimes the motions were very specific, like the falling in that one, and sometimes, like in Joseph with the knife, that there wasn't really any reference to a knife in the poem at all. It was almost like taking the poem into the realm of the symbolic. And maybe you'd like to talk about that a little bit, about where you decided to make a more symbolic poem out of it, and where you decided to go more simple and literal.
Okay, well, in Joseph, the knife is mentioned. She says, now this feel of knife for fish. And there's other references to fishing and, to hunting.
It's actually a fishing knife. To cut fish.
And there's also, references of, hunting and birds falling into the swamp and things like that. And so it really felt right to use that, to really be literal with the knife in that case.
Also part of that, part of the the knife scraping along the thing, came from a sound idea. That was more a sound idea, which actually fed into this terrific energy for what is this man scraping his windshield, you know, I mean, particularly because as we started to work on Joseph, I got a little obsessed with the woman who was actually helping me out, just standing out watching sometimes, with the idea that he was potentially a Vietnam vet. You know, somebody who is stuck in the war back home. You know, so he's scraping his windshield and he's using his fishing knife as he's scraping it, and it's getting, he's remembering something, that might have happened. And later on it comes up, the boy from Iowa who held your leg and cried into your pants until a chopper wind of an evacuation carried him out of your arms. There's certain things like that really pulsed us toward doing something like that made that feel absolutely right. Plus I have the army jacket on in there, which I actually introduced in an earlier poem, which nobody saw tonight, but called Photograph of My Room, where she mentions some fatigues from somebody back in '67. They were his, and she puts, hangs them up on stage. So that made, one way, you're talking about recurring certain themes or gestures or something, that is maybe a theme more than a gesture. But it was like, oh yeah, put myself in that army coat. Maybe somebody will recognize, what I potentially recognize there.
Actually, I did.
Yeah.
I mean, at this moment, I'd love to make a plug for the show because we are only seeing segments of it. And when producers group taped the whole thing, I was very struck by the flow, the way it really did feel like a piece of music almost more than a play, because of the recurring themes. And I always felt that the characters kept coming back, that the boy that was mentioned, who had written the letters, who had belonged to the fatigues, was then Joseph coming back. That I don't, it's interesting the way poems all written by the same person can create the same kind of imagery over and over again and knit the whole thing together. And I felt that with the way that you used the sounds, the repeating sounds, and the different themes coming back, that you really knit it all together. So, and why don't we take this opportunity to tell people where the show is and when it's playing? And
we're going to be performing The Country Between Us on February 1st, 2nd, 8th, 9th, and 15th. Those are Friday and Saturday evenings at 11 p.m. Yes, 11 p.m. after TheatreWorks' production of The Bundle at Suffolk University Theatre, which is on Temple Street on Beacon Hill. And the number you can call for reservations is 720-1988. Please come.
Kirsten is also acting in The Bundle as well.
yeah, good. Well, let's see the next tape segment now. Let's go to the tape as soon as we... Let's see, would you like to quickly introduce the... Okay, before we go to the tape, then you'll talk about the next few segments that will be on it.
The first thing that you'll be seeing is, hearing, is a Spanish song called Virgen Pájara Maria. This song is a popular revolutionary song of the Nicaraguan people. We were fortunate in our research at the beginning of working on this piece to meet a woman, Susan Van Dresser, who was a minister, and went down to Nicaragua with a group of people called Witness to Peace. And they had a song book, and this was a song that was in there, and I was very fortunate to come across that, and so I'm singing that song, part of that song.
The next one is called Return, which is about an American woman's return to America after having been in El Salvador for a while, and how frightening it is to be home in America.
The next is a very brief poem called The Visitor, and it's about a man in an El Salvadoran prison.
And the very last poem that you will hear is probably not really a poem. I think it's maybe more of a journalistic piece. It's called The Colonel. And this is probably Forshay's most famous piece. It'll speak for itself.
Okay, let's roll tape.
Virgen Pájara María, pajarita morimbo, Nicaragua pajarita, pájara revolución, pajarita libertaria, pajarita sin frontera, pajarita de Cesarea, pajarita guerriera, pajarita guasuruca, paquito amargo y dulzón, sin jaula será el futuro, pajarita insurrección, la esperanza de tus alas preñará todo el dolor, pajarita Guatemala, pajarita El Salvador. Upon my return to America, Josephine, the iced drinks and paper umbrellas, clean toilets, and Los Angeles palm trees swaying like lean women, I was afraid, more so than I had been, even of motels. So much so that for months every tire blowout was final. Every strange car near the house kept watch, and I strained even to remember things impossible to forget. You took my stories apart, sitting on your sofa with your legs tucked under you, and 50 years in your face. So, you know now, you say, what kind of money is involved, and that campesinos knife one another. And you know you should not trust anyone, so you find a few people that you will trust. You know, the mix of machetes with whiskey and the slip of the tongue that costs hundreds of lives. You've seen the pits where men and women are kept the few days it takes without food and water. You've heard the cocktail conversation upon which their release depends. And you know now why men and women of goodwill read torture reports with fascination. It is not Che Guevara, this struggle. Camilo Torres is dead. Victor Jara was rounded up with the others, and Jose Marti is a landing strip for planes from Miami to Cuba. Go, try on Americans your long, dull story of corruption. But better to give them what they want. Will Milagro Ramirez, who after years in prison did not know what year it was, how she walked with help and was forced to shit in public. Tell them about the live wire, dry ice, concrete, gray rats, and above all, who fucked her, how many times, and when. Tell them about retaliation. Jose lying in the flatbed trucks, waving his stumps into your face, his hands cut off by his captors and thrown to the many acres of cotton lost, still holding the last few lumps of leached earth. Tell them about Jose in his last few hours, and how later, many months later, a labor leader was cut to pieces and buried. Tell them about how the soldiers found the men who had done it and made them dig him up and ask forgiveness of his corpse once it was assembled again on the ground like a man. And as for the cars, of course they watch you. But for this, don't flatter yourself. We are all watched. We are all assembled. Josephine, I tell you, I have not rested since I rode those streets with a gun in my lap. Since all manner of speech has failed and the remnant of my life continues onward. Oh, I go mad, for example, in the Safeway at the many heads of lettuce and papayas, sugar and pineapple and coffee. Oh, especially the coffee. And when I talk with American men, there is some absence of recognition there, constant scotch and fine white hands. Many hours of business and penises hardened by motor ends and a faint resemblance to their wives. I cannot, Josephine, go on. I remember the American attaché in that country. His clicking pens, his tanks of fish, and his rapt devotion to his reports. His wife wrote his reports. She said as much when she came to pick him up every morning at the embassy grounds, that she was tired of his drinking, sick of covering up, and the loss of his last promotion. She was a woman who would stall out on the empty field in the Campo after 4 martinis and announce to those men and women that she was there to help. She flew where she pleased in that country with her drunken kindness, while Marines in white gloves were assigned to protect her husbands. Oh, and it was difficult work. What, with the suspicion on the rise that gringos die like other men. I cannot, Josephine. Talk to them. So, you say you know now a little about about starvation. A child like a supper scrap filling with worms, many children all strung together, all in a delicate chain. And you say you know now that people who rescue lawyers, physicists, poets, lie awake at night with reports of mice introduced into women, men whose testicles are crushed like eggs, that they cup their parts with their own bed sheets and move themselves slowly, imagining their wrists affixed to a wall where the naked are pinned, where the naked are tied open and left to the hands of those who erase what they touch. We are all erased by them and no longer resemble decent men. We no longer have the hearts, the strength, the lives of women. Your problem is not that your hands, as you say, are tied to do something. It is that you were born into an island of greed and grace, where you have this sense of yourself as apart from others. It is not your right to feel powerless. Better people than you have been powerless. You have not returned to your country, but to a life you never left.
In Spanish, he whispers, there is no time left. It is the sound of scythes arcing in wheat, the ache of some field song in Salvador. The wind along the prison, cautious as Francisco's hands on the inside, touching the walls as he walks. It is his wife's breath slipping into his cell each night while he imagines his hand to be hers. It is a small country. There is nothing one man will not do to another.
What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, and a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English.
Bang, 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 bang.
Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or to cut his fingers to lace. On the windows were gratings like those found on liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. On the table was a gold bell for ringing the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk about how difficult it had become to govern. A parrot on the terrace said, and the colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, say nothing. The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears onto the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, and dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. I'm tired of fooling around, he said. As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves. He held the last of his wine in the air and said, something for your poetry, no? Some of the ears on the ground caught the scrap of his voice. Some of the ears were pressed to the ground.
So, how did you get the idea for the red light on that face at the end of Colonel?
Well, that partly came from our designer. That is actually a replica or whatever of a Mayan mask, which is actually what we usually use. We use that sort of logo for our flyers and for our program and things like that. Our designer found that in her researches, and the most striking thing for her, and actually what we did in the end of the Colonel, was the expression on the mask's face, which is sort of, of shock, mouth open, and the hands are sort of, and if you actually saw the original, it's actually more like a bas-relief or something like that. It's very animated. It's almost like the head is out here even more than it is in the mask. And there's a few other times in the show where the mask is slightly lit when you want it to either be a little bit evocative. I mean, if there's no Central American person in the piece, that maybe is the Central American person in the piece. It's the reminder. It's the person lurking behind everything that we're bothering to do. And at that particular moment, because this was, for the end of the end of the Colonel, it just seemed, what more could you do except be potentially open-mouthed, going, I just saw somebody dump a bunch of ears on a table. And the mask, because that seemed like the right thing to do for me at the end of it, the mask became, well, let's really, and that's probably the one time that it's really lit in the whole show. The rest of the time it's sort of there. She even added, we all wore one earring in the piece. And that was sort of on a fluke, but the designer even added an earring to the mask so that we all were sort of knit together in that.
What were some of the ideas you threw away?
Oh, we had a lot of those.
Well, we actually, when we started off, we considered every poem in the book. Everyone was a potential, and then it was a matter of, well, we have to eliminate. There was a very beautiful poem called Poem for Maya, which is very much about being young. It's beautiful images of sort of running up a goat path. This is one about being in Mallorca in Spain. And we actually decided not to use that one for different reasons. Other ones got eliminated. When
we were working through the poems, I mean, the book itself it doesn't just deal with El Salvador. There's sort of the first section of the book deals with El Salvador, and the second section deals with certain things in America. One of them is called like Ninth City Walk Up, about a bag lady in New York City. There are other ones,
about Bratislava. There's something
Right.
about being in Detroit and
growing up in Detroit and her childhood. So there's a lot of different things. And a lot of them are really beautiful, and we were sort of, using them all originally. But we finally honed it down to the fact that the reason we were doing it originally was to do something about El Salvador, and we said, no, let's sort of stick to that. There are a couple of pieces in the show that aren't directly about Central America or El Salvador or anything. One of them is Photograph of My Room, which opens the show, which sort of sets the scene for the show. It's actually based on a Walker Evans picture, a photograph. So we sort of use that to set the scene. It's a simple poem. It's a simple descriptive poem.
another one we're using is Reunion, which is really a love poem about two lovers reuniting. And the way that we choose to do that one is by using a couple of jazz standards that I'm singing. And Kirsten is actually...
Which we actually hear.
Yes.
I'm wild again, beguiled
Right,
again.
bewitched, bothered, and bewildered,
Right.
and nevertheless I'm in love with you. And part of the reason, again, we wanted to use those poems were that we wanted to make sure that we were addressing the people in the audience, that they could relate, that it wouldn't be an evening of theater where you would go, oh, this is about somebody else, and this takes place somewhere else, and I can't relate to it. And we really wanted it. We wanted to have a, part of the show be that people could go, oh, right, I know this song. And not only that, nevertheless, I'm in love with you. Oh, I've thought about that in terms of someone, And this also, that particular piece is very much another duet. And that is really what it's about. And we just felt that it also provides some relief, if you will, in, the context of some of the more intense images that the rest of the show portrays.
We're going to have to wrap up pretty soon, but I want to ask you just quickly, even just editing the show, having seen these images and hearing the words over and over again, you know, how actually torturing it is to keep coming up against these images of torture and carnage and just desperation. And how did you feel working on the show, having to go home with that every night?
Well, one thing that was important in the way that we were, for myself, and the way that I was composing music for it, was how can we portray this in a way that we aren't overly getting emotional? You know what I'm saying? We can't, you know, we don't want this to be too melodramatic almost, or too sentimental, even a love poem, you know? Yeah. There's certain, when images are that strong, you have to back away from them, you have to let them be, and the words say them, you know? So to a certain extent, I feel that we had to distance ourselves from them. If we would have gotten so dramatic about a particular moment, then it would be the actress, it wouldn't be what the words were, if I'm being clear on that.
There's sort of a saying in theater to a certain degree too, which is the moment you cry, the audience stops because they're watching you cry and they get fascinated with your tears as opposed to what might potentially be going on. You shouldn't take it away from the audience that way. You should leave it to them a bit. So, I mean, plus when you're working on something so technically nitpicking and fixing this and fixing that, you forget about what, somewhat degree of what the content is.
Right. Well, thanks for coming, Kirsten and Lisa. It's been wonderful talking to you. If you'd like to see the show again, people out there, it will be rebroadcast on Thursday night, January 31st at 8 o'clock, and again on Tuesday night at 8 o'clock, February 5th. And again, COSI, Country Between Us, 720-1899, 1988. And we're glad to have you here tonight. Thanks. Okay, yeah. So, now more.
I'm wild again, beguiled again, a simpering, whimpering child again, bewitched, bothered and bewildered am I. Couldn't sleep and wouldn't sleep when love came and told me I shouldn't sleep, bewitched, bothered and bewildered am I. Lost my heart, but what of it? He's cold, I agree. He can laugh, but I love it, although the laugh's on me.
On the phonograph, the voice of a woman already dead for 3 decades, singing of a man that could make her do anything.
Bewitched, bothered and bewildered am I.
On the table, 2 fragile glasses of black